So those waves that I talked about in the last video, once they make it to the coast, they have a tremendous ability to result in interesting coastal landscapes through the erosion and movement of sediment. Both waves themselves actually have the power to erode in areas where there's cliffs, but also waves over time coming from a certain direction create these local currents that have the power to move sediments down a beach in one specific direction over time. So the first direct impact from these waves are where we get coastal erosion right where waves hit the cliffs. Remember that hydraulic action that we talked about in rivers? That's where we had like rivers running so fast that they could just like tear a cap off your head. Well, this hydraulic action plays a part in erosion of cliffs along the ocean as well. Especially in these coastlines where water depth rises rapidly, you get waves crashing right along the shoreline, often focused into these headland areas like you see on the slide. You get refraction causing these waves to bend in. They crash right on a cliff area, something like a headland, and when water hits that rock, you get this massive energy explosion basically on the rock. You can get water actually picking apart little pieces of mineral or rock out of that cliff area. Or you can also get water running into the joints of the rock where they compress air and break particles loose. Over time, in cliff areas where waves are hitting directly on the cliff, you get an undercut cliff. Waves erode away at the bottom of a cliff, that steeper area up above. The waves don't hit it directly, but over time, they kind of dig out a cave underneath those higher areas. And what you end up with is all that mass of the overhanging cliff eventually falling down due to mass movement. So you get rockfall or a landslide as a big chunk of cliff falls into the ocean. So you get direct erosion and rearrangement of coastlines due to this wave action. And this happens all the time, even around here. This is Grandview Beach in Encinitas, where a cliff collapsed there. This was a pretty major cliff collapse. It's a pretty small cliff, but over time, again, those waves at high tide would erode away the bottom of that cliff at the top of the beach, and over time, all that weight of the overlying material over that area that had been eroded away at the bottom of the cliff became too much, and a big chunk of this cliff fell down onto the beach. And unfortunately, in this case, people died because of this cliff collapse. It was a major local tragedy because there were people hanging out just under that cliff right there. But in other places with bigger cliffs, we get even bigger collapses where massive amounts of rock material can pour onto the beach, ultimately feeding sediment into that coastal system and also causing erosion over time as those cliffs retreat away from where the waves are breaking. In addition to those locations where waves are actually hitting cliffs and directly eroding them away, we're getting back to the idea that there are currents along the beach, these local currents, that are also important for creating landscapes and moving sediment. So again, in these littoral areas, we have what's called a longshore current. Coastlines can point in all directions, and waves can also come from any direction that's pointing out towards the open ocean. Unlike most of the examples I've shown so far, on most coastlines, the swells that arrive and the waves that ultimately break on the beach arrive from far-off storms that arrive at an angle to the beach. They don't arrive straight onto the beach. Usually waves are either coming from the north or the south. That's because they're created by storms. And remember, those storms or mid-latitude cyclones usually happen in the mid-latitude areas. There's specific areas around 50 degrees north or south where most of these storms are originated and most waves ultimately come from. So if we get waves coming from the north or coming from the south here in California, they come in at an angle. And that results in what's called this longshore drift or littoral drift, also called a longshore current. When we have waves all coming from one direction over time, we get both that surge from the waves that comes up the beach and the backwash coming back from that surge back down into the ocean water, all moving predominantly in one direction. That's illustrated in the figure to the top right. Breaking waves push water up onto the beach, but a little bit towards the left in this case. Then that water coming back is also moving towards the left as well. Over time, this results in water right along that shore pushing in one direction, and also, as we'll see, the sediment or sand kind of moving one direction over time. The beach actually moves because of these consistent currents. We often see this here in Southern California during something like a big swell. In the image to the bottom left, this is Newport Beach during a significant south swell. South swell means that the waves are coming from the south, either from a hurricane off the coast of Mexico or a big storm way in the southern hemisphere. And in this case, these waves coming from the south are predominantly breaking in one direction. You can see that there's an open face towards us on these waves, and the breaking waves are kind of far away. They're coming in at a major angle to the beach. That means both the current of the water as well as the movement of sand grains individually are going to be from the south to the north or towards us in this case. So if that guy surfing that wave right there just kind of stopped surfing and was just sitting in the water, there'd be a really strong current pulling him towards us. Because again, waves are breaking behind him, but not in front of him. In addition to these longshore currents, or littoral currents, we have what are called rip currents. And just as a quick note regarding terminology, a lot of times people say rip tide. Rip current is more accurate because it's related to these longshore currents. It's not really related to tides at all. We talked about tides before. Rip currents generally have nothing to do with tides. But these occur because these longshore currents have some variability within them. We have this water generally pushing in one direction along the coastline, but eventually it has to push out to sea. So we have this narrow current of water running back out to sea from the shoreline as kind of an escape for all this water moving in one direction along the shore according to this longshore current. Generally, when there are a lot of waves, both the wind and the waves are pushing water molecules up towards the beach. Eventually, those molecules being pushed up the shore have to flow back out, and they do so at this path of least resistance. So usually it's a slightly deeper area along the shoreline. Water can flow out just like a river. So what you see is a current, like in the bottom left right here, you have these black arrows pulling back out to sea in this deeper area away from where the waves are breaking. And a lot of times these are pretty clear when you're looking at an area of beach. You'll have waves breaking all along the coast, but then there's an area where there's just no waves breaking at all. Usually this is the rip current where the water is being pushed back out to sea. And just a note, if you're swimming near the shore when there are big waves and you find yourself being pulled out to sea, just swim sideways rather than back into shore to get out of that rip. Swimming back into shore is swimming against the rip. It's going to tire you out really quickly. If you move sideways, like in this picture in the bottom left, you'll get out of the rip pretty quickly because they're usually pretty narrow. You might get hit by a few waves after you do that, but at least you won't be pulled further out to sea. So these waves and the currents they cause have significant impacts on the coastal landscape. Because we have these longshore currents operating, they're actually causing erosion and transport of particles as they're operating. So in beach landscapes, we have the zigzag motion of not just the water pushing up on the beach and then back out to sea, but we also have the movement of individual sediments as this is happening. As we have that water surging up the beach, some particles are brought along with that water, things like sand and silt being pushed up the beach, and additionally, when we have that backwash coming back down off the beach, sand is also being moved there. Over time, sediment is transported down the beach along the direction of those predominant currents. So in the bottom left, there aren't really big waves here, but the waves that do exist are kind of all focused in one direction. You can see them coming in at an angle to the beach. All those like whitewater lines are kind of oriented down and to the right. That means overall, we get a longshore current from the top of the figure down towards the bottom. Over time, that sand is going to move in that direction if we have a consistent current in the same direction. So along any coastline, we have the movement of sediment in the direction of the longshore current, or the average longshore current over time. We also have an input of sediment and loss of sediment, depending on different geographic factors. And if you put all these things together, you have what's called a sediment budget. This is essentially an accounting of where sediment comes from, where it goes, and ultimately where it's lost from the coast. Different things happening along a coast can cause either a gain or a loss of sediment or sand in a location. Rivers emptying out into the sea would be a gain of sediment. Remember in the last section we talked about these fluvial processes. Rivers at the end of their longitudinal profile are depositional. When they let out into the sea or a lake, they basically leave behind all the sediment that they carried. Erosion from cliffs or from the dunes behind a beach would be a gain of sediment. Longshore transport, if you're bringing sand in from elsewhere, that would be a gain of sediment as well. So in this case, we have these black arrows showing where there are gains of sediment in this coastal system. And that's from longshore transport brought in from somewhere else, from beach erosion. So we're actually bringing sediment onto the beach from the areas behind the beach, maybe because of wind or because of rainfall, bringing some of that local sand down onto the beach. And then also, of course, a big one is that river discharge, where you get all the sediment carried by a river let out into the coast. But then, of course, there are also losses of sediment along all coasts, and these are shown in this figure as well. There's erosion off of beaches. There's also longshore transport that can take sediment away from a system. So in this case, we have longshore transport both adding sediment, but also taking it away out the other side. You can have wind blowing sand inward into an area of dunes, causing a decrease in the size of the beach just because of this wind blowing sand away. Overall, a sediment budget accounts for all these gains and losses, and you get an understanding of whether a given area is either gaining or losing sediment over time. A beach is not a fixed entity, and geomorphologists study how they change over time. In a lot of places, we're actually losing beaches because these sources of sediment are being cut off, and the areas of loss of sediment still exist. Coastal areas are among the most highly populated in the world. A large proportion of the world's population lives pretty close to coastal areas, and that means in most coastal areas we've upset the natural sediment budgets. Humans have built things that have caused these natural sediment budgets to completely change. Again, sediment usually comes from either eroding cliffs or from the outflow of rivers. Most rivers, especially big rivers, have been dammed, and if you build a dam in a river, it actually blocks the sediment from coming out of the river. That means less sediment makes it out. We can build other things that block the flow as well, like these jetties at this harbor entrance shown on the slide right here. Sometimes we do this intentionally to help maintain sediment in places, but in other cases we do it kind of unintentionally. We're trying to protect the harbor, and by doing that we upset the sediment budget. So some of these structures that are specifically built to keep sand in an area are called jetties or groins. So groins usually occur in sequence, kind of going down the beach. They're built next to each other, and the idea is that they can lock in sand. So we have this average direction of longshore drift, and by putting a series of groins along the beach, the sediment gets stopped from moving completely out of the system. So it stays stagnant in the sediment budget instead of being lost from the budget. So these groins are intended to keep sand in an area. Then we also have jetties. These are usually built to keep sediment from filling into a harbor. Oceanside has a few jetties that are for this purpose. They basically block the sediment from coming down according to this natural direction of longshore drift, and to keep it from entering the harbor mouth and making it so it's too shallow for boats to come in and out. But a lot of times they keep sediment from moving further down in a natural way that they would have otherwise. Finally, in an effort to kind of counteract some of these negative impacts we've had on beach systems, we often dump sand at spots up from the normal current of a beach. So we dredge sand up from the seafloor, from like inside a harbor, or we actually transport sand from behind a dam and put it onto the beach so that it starts drifting down according to that longshore current and nourishing the beach. We call this beach nourishment. We're basically like giving it more sand so the beach stays in place. And this is really important in Southern California, especially now because of climate change. We're losing sand a lot faster than we naturally get sand. So this shows kind of the big picture of sediment budgets in different parts of Southern California. We have a few different compartments. These are kind of self-contained units of sediment. If you'll notice, we're part of the Oceanside compartment. This is where we get movement of sediment over time from around Camp Pendleton all the way down to La Jolla. Based on the average direction of the longshore current, we generally have movement from north to south along our compartment. Eventually that sand builds up as we get further down towards the end of our sediment budget, and it exits through La Jolla Canyon. So we have like a deep area offshore where all the remaining sand basically gets pulled out to sea. But if we look a lot closer at our coastline and Oceanside, things are a lot more complicated than that. We don't just get all this sand collecting from all the cliffs in Camp Pendleton on our beaches, and that's again because we've built things that interrupt this normal sand flow. But overall, we have this direction of longshore transport from north to south. Sometimes in summer we do get south swells that have a small influence on pushing sand back north, but overall, on average, sand's going to move from the north to the south. So sand grains that exist at like Oceanside Harbor now might end up in Carlsbad over a certain time period. So looking at something like a sediment budget on a local scale results in things getting a lot more complicated. This is the scene in Oceanside. I'm looking at it in Google Earth right here, and we have a couple items of note. I'm actually going to launch this in a way that I can draw on it and get back to the slide in a second. So the first thing to note, that as a part of this Oceanside littoral cell, we have the general movement of sediment according to that average transport direction, which is from north to south, in this case, North is to the left, south is to the right. So I'm going to draw an arrow showing the direction on average of the longshore current. Now looking at our sediment budget, again, there's a few different ways that we gain and lose sediment in this area. The first thing is that we get that sediment moving over time according to that longshore drift. So we have a gain of sediment from the north into this scene. We also have a river mouth here. So traditionally, river mouths are kind of the main sources of sediment. We have the San Luis Rey River here. So we have a gain of sediment. And again, that comes out and ultimately is going to be pushed from the north to the south because of this longshore drift. But what's problematic in Oceanside is you can see there's a lot of beach over here north of the harbor. A lot of that sand doesn't make it down to the city of Oceanside itself. It's been collecting from north to south through Camp Pendleton, and it either exits back out to sea right there because of the harbor, or just kind of stays put right here north of the harbor. Meanwhile, we've dammed this river. There's all sorts of like modifications, channelization, things like that. We actually don't get as much sediment as we used to right here out of the San Luis Rey. Overall, you can see that there's a lot more sediment here at the harbor beach and a lot less as we get further south, further away from that direction of transport. As it turns out, Oceanside's sediment budget is completely off kilter. We have a lot larger loss of sediment. Again, the sediment that makes it to the end here kind of flows off screen. Some more of it in winter gets pulled back off the coast, back out to sea. Overall, there's more loss of sediment than there is gain. That's why we get a smaller beach as we go down to the southern side of Oceanside. Because there's not enough natural sediment flow through this system, we actually have to nourish the beaches. And we do that by dredging out the harbor. Some of the sediment actually settles in the harbor mouth, and we don't want that because that makes it more difficult for boats to get out the harbor. So we actually take sediment using a barge from right here in the harbor, and we pump that either to the harbor beach or to the northern part of Oceanside, or even most recently we built a pipeline all the way south of the pier, releasing sediment here, resulting in basically a new artificial source of sediment on this part of the beach. Hopefully augmenting this budget enough so that we end up with a beach here in southern Oceanside going into the future. But this is a very difficult thing to kind of maintain indefinitely going on into the future. And actually, as this dredging was occurring last year and we were getting this movement of sediment from the harbor mouth down across the beach and the release of sediment south of the pier, I actually got some videos of this, so I'm going to show them next. I'm out here on Oceanside Pier right now, and I'm watching the dredging going on here behind me. So they're actually pumping out water from Oceanside Harbor and putting it onto the beach right here. The whole reason they do this is to nourish the sand so that there's more sand down the beach later on in the season. This happens because of the construction of the harbor up about a mile from where we are now, and also because of climate change. Over time, the waves during winter wash away more sand than gets replenished from natural sources. And that means that the federal government and local governments get together to pay to dredge sand out of the harbor and pump it onto the beach. This time, they're taking sand from all the way up to the harbor to the south side of the pier, which is longer than they usually do. And so they're pumping sand out right here and hoping that in the next few months it gets pushed down the beach and builds up the beach, some of those areas further south. It's a pretty interesting engineering work, and it's pretty interesting to know where our beaches actually come from, that we actually have to nourish them to keep the sand in that spot. It's not completely natural anymore, because the sediment budget is completely off-kilter due to human construction as well as climate change and sea level rise, bringing some of that sediment back out to the ocean.